Hello and welcome to the Cycling Podcast. Before this week's special Paris-Roubaix preview, we'd like to say a huge thank you to Humans Invent and Sharp for their support since we began this podcast last June. Don't worry, the podcast is not going anywhere, but for the moment we will be known as the Cycling Podcast, and we have a new website, www.thecyclingpodcast.com, and a Twitter account, @cycling_podcast. But now, without further ado, on with the show.
This is the Cycling Podcast with Richard Moore, Lionel Burney and Daniel Freed.
Hello and welcome to a special cycling podcast looking at Paris-Roubaix. My name is Richard Moore and I'm with Lionel Burney.
Hello Richard.
And Daniel Freed.
Hi Rich.
We have exclusive interviews with Sean Kelly talking about his victory in 1984. We're coming up to the 30th year anniversary of that. We've got Tom Boonen, who has won the race 4 times, of course, a record that he shares with Roger de Vlaeminck. And we'll hear also from Taylor Phinney, certainly perhaps a future champion, we suspect, but somebody who has won the under-23 race twice.
Did you notice there Daniel was itching to jump in at the merest mention of Roger de Vlaeminck?
Well, Roger de Vlaeminck may pop up in the heated debate at the end of
The Cycling Podcast, interviews and analysis. We've got the big talking points covered.
What makes Paris-Roubaix special? And that's the question that I think we should kick off with. Daniel.
Well, Richard, it goes from Paris to Roubaix.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't.
No. Well, it's one of those things that it almost goes without saying what makes it special.
Well, this is going to be a really good podcast then.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Next week we'll...
Lionel, do you want to kick off?
Well, it's unique, and we say this in sport all the time, don't we? That we're never slow in kind of bestowing legendary status on riders or events, but Paris-Roubaix really is. It's a race that belongs to another time. The whole of the sport has completely moved on in so many ways, but Paris-Roubaix remains an event which, pretty much unchanged from its earliest days in the 1890s. The roads are deliberately maintained, or rather not maintained, so that they retain the character. They retain the character. There's in fact there's a group, the Friends of Paris-Roubaix, Les Amis de Paris-Roubaix, who actually ensure that the local authorities don't tarmac over any of these cobbled roads, so that the race retains that unique character. And it really is a race that it so tightly embeds the sport with the countryside. Everything that we know about Paris-Roubaix, it's a fairly grim corner of northeastern France. These days the race, it doesn't start in Paris, it starts in Compiègne, which is actually a very nice town with some lovely cobbled squares, and the riders really do, without sort of getting into too much of the kind of World War One sort of mythology that has grown up around the race. It's called the Hell of the North because of World War One, really, because of the battlefields that it goes goes through some areas that were completely destroyed by the war. But it does feel like when you see the riders roll out of Compiègne, you just never quite know what is going to happen out there on the road. They're all, it's a race where, yes, team work does matter, but it's every man for himself, and the person who gets to the velodrome first is the best survivor, basically.
It does feel like a very old-fashioned race. I remember one year driving along the motorway, and on the motorway you're locked into this very sort of 21st century mode of travelling and glancing across the fields and seeing the riders. You can almost see them battering along these cobbled tracks, crisscrossing the fields, and there was this huge disconnect I felt between our mode of transport and theirs. And when you see the riders, the bikes have not changed a great deal. They'll have padded, they'll have extra layers of bar tape on to try and cushion the blows. They have tried in some years to, technological innovations such as suspension forks, I remember being used on occasion. I remember Steve Bauer's special bike that he had built in around 1990, or perhaps just before that, but Steve Bauer was a Canadian who became a kind of specialist on the cobbles, and he had this bizarre, almost recumbent bike that he he introduced. It wasn't a particularly aesthetically pleasing design, so I'm glad it didn't catch on. But the bikes are like a throwback. The riders themselves are almost a throwback to a different era, and it does feel like you're watching a sport, an event that hasn't really changed an awful lot over the last 100 years, I guess. And I think that's probably what makes it special for me.
Yeah, and the fact that there's no clamour from anyone, and certainly not from the riders, to change it, which is something we're not accustomed to seeing in professional cycling. We often hear riders sort of railing against what they perceive as kind of anachronisms in the sport. For instance, you take the race radio debate. There was uproar when the UCI wanted to go sort of back in time and abandon race radios, but there are no real complaints from the riders. They appreciate how, as Lionel says, embedded in the culture of the sport something like Paris-Roubaix is.
Yeah, I mean, it's also, from the spectator's point of view, a brilliant day's spectating if you're there, and it's probably the most televisual of races. It's something that, when I've tried over the years to kind of introduce friends to cycling, they kind of get the Tour de France. You can explain that quite well, and they kind of instantly get Paris-Roubaix. This is a race from A to Z, and it goes over these horrendous roads, and you do get a sense of how bad the roads are on TV. Often TV kind of irons out gradients in the mountains. It doesn't make the roads look as hard as perhaps they are, but there's you are guaranteed crashes, you're guaranteed punctures, you're guaranteed drama of some description. And the other beauty of the race is that you can say that the strongest, luckiest rider of the day won the race, because it is a combination of those two factors that will crown the winner.
Well, I think that is one of the most kind of anachronistic and refreshing aspects of it, the fact that luck is so important, and again, it's unique in that riders, and sportsmen in general, in the modern day, tend to sort of take umbrage at any sort of excess influence of luck. They tend to feel that it's their right to compete on a playing field which almost eliminates the kind of uncontrollables, whereas in Paris-Roubaix they just seem to accept that luck is going to play a huge part.
Although one exception to that is Bernard Hinault, who, going back 30 years, was a very vocal opponent of Paris-Roubaix and all that it stood for, and the Tour of Flanders for that matter. He didn't see what racing on such badly kept, such rough roads had to do with bike racing. He railed against Paris-Roubaix in particular, and typically of Hinault, of course, he did win Paris-Roubaix in 1981, and it was the last time he ever rode it. He rode it several times and always finished quite high up in the race. The cobbles also featured quite regularly back then in the Tour de France route. In both 79 and 80, there were long, big sections of cobbles. We've got the cobbles in the Tour this year, of course, 2014. These days they tend to appear every sort of 5, 7, 8 years. Back then they were slightly more common, and Hinault felt that riding Paris-Roubaix was necessary for the Tour, but he hated the cobbles and really, as I say, railed against them. But Hinault's unusual in being a rider who could win the Tour, who did ride Paris-Roubaix, and nowadays, as he pointed out when I interviewed him on this last year, do any Grand Tour contenders even ride Paris-Roubaix?
No, it hasn't happened for a long time, really. Sean Kelly was a contender for Grand Tours when he was winning Paris-Roubaix. He won it in 1984 and 1986, and around that time I think he was sort of 4th and 5th in the Tour, and he'd been up there in the Vuelta as well at that time. Greg LeMond actually rode it, didn't he?
I was about to say that I think LeMond's fairly sort of poignant retirement from Paris-Roubaix was almost brought down the curtain on an era. I think in 1994, didn't he pull out fairly down on his luck and gave a fairly downbeat interview at the end of that Paris-Roubaix, and I think that pretty much brought the curtain down on the era where Grand Tour specialists would ride Paris-Roubaix.
I think the only other major exception to that would be Laurent Fignon, who really tried to win it as well. I think he was, certainly in the top 10 in 1988 when Thomas Wegmüller's chances of winning were ruined when a plastic bag blew across the road and lodged in his derailleur before the sprint finish. And I think Dirk de Mol won that year, and I'm pretty sure that was the last year when they had a few years in the 80s when it finished outside the La Redoute factory in Roubaix rather than in the velodrome, and the reason for that was that La Redoute was a sponsor of the race at the time. But Fignon would probably be the last Grand Tour winner to have seriously had a go at trying to win it.
And I mean, the finish in the velodrome is also something that makes Paris-Roubaix a very special race. We've probably all been in there. The velodrome itself is almost like a throwback as well. It does feel like it belongs to a previous era. It's an open air, big wide concrete bowl, basically, that riders enter from the street. And there is a unique atmosphere in there, certainly as you're waiting for the riders to appear. You've got the big screen, you've got a big crowd, and there's a real sense of excitement. You've watched the race unfold. You've watched, there might be a group that comes in together to sprint it out, or it might be a rider on his own. But either way, that moment when the rider enters the velodrome is extraordinarily special. It's like a goal being scored. That's what the atmosphere is like at that time. It's charged.
And in terms of watching the race unfold on TV, the cobbled sections are numbered, and the numbers count down from whether it's 26 or 28 sections these days, I don't know, but and the cameramen on the motorbikes have this habit of tilting the camera up to film the banner that signals the start of the section, and then the banner that signals the finish, and it's kind of almost like a road sign with the number, and then at the end of the section there's a number with a red line through it, and you get this sort of, you can't help but feel that tension building up as the numbered sections go down. And if you were to sit down on the Sunday afternoon and watch Paris-Roubaix from the Forest of Arenberg section onwards, it's impossible not to get caught up in that sort of galloping sense of drama.
You're listening to the Cycling Podcast. Tweet us at cycling_podcast.
Well, I hate to be the one to correct the Badger, Bernardino, but his famous quote, which he has repeated fairly recently to Richard, that he hated Paris-Roubaix so much that he won it in 1981 and then never rode it again, is actually not true. He rode again in 1982 and finished 9th. But why let the facts get in the way of a good anecdote?
It might have been a different Bernardino.
It's one of the great urban checkable myths as well of cycling, that Hino, he only rode it once and won, and also that what Rich just said.
I did write in my book, Slaying the Badger, in the first edition, that he only rode it once and won it, which is definitely not true. He won it. He did ride it several times, but in an interview last year, he did say that he never rode it after 81 in protest at Felix Levitin refusing to let him ride in the Tour of America, is what he said. So the Badger, very black or white sort of bloke, but often wrong.
Often a liar.
Badgers are very black and white. It's
frequently lies.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, moving on. A couple of years after Eno's famous 9th place finish in the 1982 Paris-Roubaix, Sean Kelly won it for the first time, 1984, 30 years ago this spring. And I caught up with Sean at Paris-Nice to find out exactly how that victory came about.
You have to be aggressive. If you're not aggressive, you're not in the race. There's so many other people who are aggressive as well. And to get onto the cobbles after Valenciennes, around 100 kilometres, everybody's feeling good. The professionals, 100 kilometres is nothing for them. For me, it's worse than the big finishes, the big sprint finishes in the Tour of France or whatever big bunch sprints you have, because you have so many riders up there. They want to stay in contention because they know if they get through the first number of cobbles, well, then it settles down and you're into the race. So you have so many guys fighting, and you get all these Belgium guys who are specialists in those sorts of events, big heavyweights. They throw their weight around, and there's always crashes. If you go back 25, 30 years plus before you get to the cobbles, the first section of cobbles, there's always crashes, and that's always your first concern. Then when you get through that, you get onto the cobble sections in a good position, then you're worried about other guys crashing in front of you, but more so mechanical, because if you have a mechanical problem in the earlier sections, and you haven't got a team where there's going to be riders close to you, and it was often the case for me that I didn't really have a great backup of riders who were capable of doing the classics. The cars are a long ways off, because the bunch of 180 plus riders, the team car can be 2 minutes plus behind. So if you have to wait that amount, well, then the race can be over for you, which 150 kilometres to go.
You described it as a fairly horrendous experience when you first rode the Paris-Roubaix as a young professional, but by 1984 you'd got to grips with them. How can you describe the cobbles, and do they differ to the ones in the Tour of Flanders?
I suppose you could compare it as if you put the Premiership soccer player in England and you put him into a rugby match. It would be something the same. And coming from Ireland, moving to France in the beginning for the first number of years, and then moving to Belgium, had no great experience of riding the cobbles. Had ridden some races in Belgium where you ride over, good quality cobbles, but Paris-Roubaix, it was a real scare for me, and I hadn't ridden the route either, because the first year to ride I wasn't down to take the start, and then with the Flandre 18 there was some of the riders sick, so I was put in the last 2 or 3 days before the event, so never went out and rode any part of the route, and it was just a horror story from the moment we got on the first cobbles, and I think I crashed 3 or 4 times. I just wasn't able to ride over the cobbles, and on that day I said to myself, first of all, well, how do these guys do it? How is it possible to ride over the cobbles? And on the wet sections, there were some on that day. I was just sliding all over the place, and as I said, went down many times. I never thought I would see myself winning a Paris-Roubaix.
So what changed? How did you get to grips with them? Was it just a matter of experience, learning how to ride them? What was your technique?
Slowly you start riding some of the other events. In Belgium you ride the Tour of Flanders, and you have a lot of the other events like Curen, Brussels, Curen. You had Harelbeke, Waregem. They all go over, quite a lot of the Mons, the little short climbing cobbles, and also you have some section of cobbles. And of course you have to be a special type of rider as well. Being a sprinter in my earlier days, that helped a lot. It was just the bike handle I think I had to improve. I probably had the ability to do that, the power to get over them, but just my bike handling I had to learn that.
In the Paris-Roubaix, it's often said that there's only a handful of riders who truly could perhaps win any given edition of the race, but you do also see some surprise victories. Your victory in 1984 wasn't a surprise, so was it? You were already up there as one of the pre-race favourites.
Yes, I was coming, and I had broken into the mould of classic riders, possible classic winners, and as I said, I had won a Tour of Lombardy, so there was a number of riders there. There was 8 or 10 riders who were dominating the classics and who were pretty much in the final of all the classics. And if you're a new kid on the block, to break in there, with those guys, it's never easy. So you have to prove yourself, I think, in previous classics and previous years, and I had done that. So you have to be good, of course, on the day, and then you have to have the look, I suppose, as well, and not have the bad look, I suppose, in a Paris-Roubaix is the way of putting it.
So how did that 1984 race pan out for you? Because you were chasing down a lead group of 2 riders from the same team, La Redoute, wasn't it? And then you found yourself in a position where it probably was your race to lose as you were coming towards the velodrome.
Yes, well, there was the 2 riders who went out quite early, Gregor Braun and Alain Bondu from La Redoute, 2 from the same team. And I remember, they were hanging out there at, I think, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and 70 kilometres to go, 80 kilometres to go. I was probably getting a little bit scared that they weren't going to be taken back, and I remember speaking to Garibaldi a number of times. Went back to the car. I said, I think I should attack now pretty soon, and he said, no, wait. He said, those guys, they will just come back automatically because they've been out there for so long. And I think it was a good tactic that I waited for quite a long time. I certainly would have went to the attack probably 25 or 30 kilometres earlier if I hadn't the guidance of John de Garibaldi. And then I did attack, and it was still quite a long ways out. It was probably 40 kilometres out, I reckon. I attacked, got quite a nice gap. Then I was looking about, and I could see there was a lone rider coming across. So I just knocked it off a bit and waited. And I was joined up by the Belgian rider Rogiers. We sat to ride, and he was prepared to ride a bit. He was riding very strong over the cobbles actually. On some of the sections I was maybe taking it a bit easy. I didn't want to take too much risk because I knew the two riders out front that we were going to take them back, and from the group we had left I felt that we had a great chance of staying away, so I was probably being a bit more cautious. But yeah, I think he was valuable as well because he did take a lot of turns and rode with me a lot of the time, and from the moment we caught the two riders out front I think they were pretty much cooked when we caught up with them. And the concern is having a mechanical problem on the final sections, and that's something you're always worried about, because if you're in a two-man leading group and you have a mechanical problem, well then you can lose 20-30 seconds, and it's difficult, very difficult to pull a guy back in those closing stages.
And so you and Rudy Rogiers were coming to the finish, and I believe Di Gribaldi said to you, don't mess it up, or words to that effect. The pressure was on a little bit for the sprint in the velodrome, because you would have been the favourite because of your ability in the sprint.
Yes, well I would be the favourite because Rogiers wasn't fast in the sprint, and I knew that I had the advantage, but as you get to an end of a Paris-Roubaix you're starting to feel tired, and you can feel that you've been over 50 kilometres of cobbles, 260 kilometres of racing, so the body is starting to get a bit weary, so your sprint is always not going to be that great, and you're concerned the guy you're with, if he's on a real good day and he's finishing very strong. We've seen it in the past, we've seen it of more recent, where at the end of a classic it's not the best sprinter that win all the time, so I was concerned, and getting the right position as you go onto the track also. And I think Gribaldi said to me, you can't lose this one or something to that effect, and that makes you more nervous again.
And the day afterwards, I gather you gave yourself a day off from training, is that right? Or did you go out for a little ride in the afternoon?
I think I could have skipped that day because I had a lot of journalists came to the house where I was living with the Nice family in Vilvoorde, so there was a lot of the Belgian press and possibly the TV also, so a lot of my day was taken up, and I was hoping to get out in the afternoon, but things went quite late, so it would not be the norm that you'd miss a day after a classic, because unless you have a lot of media stuff to do, or the weather is very bad, you would normally go out and ride for an hour and a half, because that's the best way to recover after the classic.
The Cycling Podcast. Subscribe on iTunes, listen on Audioboo, and visit us at thecyclingpodcast.com.
So that was Sean Kelly reflecting on his 1984 victory in Paris-Roubaix, one I remember very clearly. And you guys, do you have any favourite memories from Paris-Roubaix, other races you've watched or races that you've attended?
Well, I would say the 1994 Paris-Roubaix was probably the first one that I watched kind of almost in its entirety on satellite television, and that was held in absolutely abysmal conditions. It was one of those days when it had rained, I think, solidly for sort of 2 days before, so the roads were already wet, but then it dried up on the day, but it just meant that the cobbles were wet and muddy and everyone got covered in a sort of black film very early on. And Andrei Chmil, the Moldovan, Russian, Belgian rider, won, and I was kind of blown away by just the sort of toughness of it all. And I think Sean Yates, the British rider, was fifth, and that was kind of, I think, the best result by a British rider at the time. So I remember watching that, and probably of the races that I've been to watch, 2001 edition, which I covered, stands in the memory for the same reason really. The weather was appalling the day before, the cobbles were wet, and I was travelling with a photographer, and the idea was that we would bunny hop down the route really, because one of the great things about Paris-Roubaix for kind of the seasoned spectator is that the course as it runs northeast is kind of parallel to the auto routes. So if you know what you're doing and you've got a good map, and you kind of build this experience up over the years of covering it, or in my case at that time I was with a photographer who had covered it several times, so he knew where he was going and what he was doing. We saw it several times that day, and we saw them leave at the start, pristine, clean jerseys and shorts. We saw them on the road, on the tarmac, before they'd hit the cobbles. And then we saw them after maybe 2 or 3 sections, and it was a completely different race by that stage. Riders had taken their sunglasses off, and they just had clean sort of eyes appearing through a black film of all the mud that had been thrown up onto their faces and onto their jerseys. You could barely identify the riders from their jerseys because they were just all grey-black. And the riders at the front, the pace was really on, but then as you get further down the field, it's just stragglers and hangers-on just trying to survive or get to the next feed zone to probably, or wherever the next team support vehicle is to kind of pull out of the race. And we saw a couple of people, you just know when you're seeing a rider come past you who's got a flat tyre and they're just trying to get over that section, riding on the rim with every single jarring bounce making a really quite a sort of unpleasant sound. And then we saw them several sections on from that, and then we saw them at the Carrefour de l'Arbre, and then we absolutely flew it to the finish, and saw what I thought was the sprint finish for the victory, and I thought Wilfred Peters had won, but actually Servais Carnarvon, his Domo teammate, had finished alone in front of them. But it was just a day when you just never knew really what you were watching or what you were looking at. You were just kind of looking for visual clues and just sort of seeing these survivors battle their way through and over the cobbles.
My favourite one from watching it on TV, I don't even know if I watched it on TV. I might just have read about it in Cycling Weekly at the time. But the 1990 race, which was, to me, sort of epitomised that unique finish in the velodrome, which I'm such a fan of, and Daniel isn't. He conceded in the break there. He doesn't like the velodrome, but it was the closest ever finish. Eddie Planckaert and Steve Bauer. I mentioned Bauer earlier. He was a sort of perennial contender. Paris-Roubaix. It was quite unusual at the time for an English-speaking rider to be contesting these classics, which, although the tours had been infiltrated by some of the Le Mans and won the tour, Kelly, Miller, etc. The classics, for all that Sean Kelly had won a few, the classics still seemed almost a bridge too far. And Bauer tried for several years to win Paris-Roubaix, and this was certainly as close as he ever came. It was the closest ever finish. I just watched it again, actually, and it was Jean-Marie Wampers, the Panasonic rider, gave a fantastic lead out to Eddie Planckaert, and it was all going perfectly until Edvig van Hooijdonk, who was a big, lanky rider who won Tour Flanders at least a couple of times. He attacked, going over the top. Bauer followed him, and he got the perfect lead out in the end from Van Hooijdonk. Then Planckaert came over the top again, and you couldn't separate them, and it was certainly the closest finish that there has ever been in Paris-Roubaix. A terrific race.
Yeah, I've spoken to all of those guys about that race, and Planckaert and Bauer genuinely didn't know who had won. They both sort of slumped on the grass in the middle of the track, and they were waiting for the photo finish basically, and they gave it to Planckaert. No suggestion that Bauer should have won it. I think that was the right result. The photo showed that, but it was very, very close. And of course, that was what a lot of Belgian fans do go across the border to the velodrome to watch. So it would have been an unpopular verdict had they given it to Bauer.
Just remembered as well, Wampers was the defending champion at the time. He'd been a very surprise winner the previous year. Occasionally, very occasionally, Paris-Roubaix does throw up a complete surprise. Servais Carnarvon was one. Johan van Summeren more recently was a surprise winner, but usually it's the strongest man that wins.
Surely, Daniel. Sorry, you must be able to shed a little bit of light on the Mappé 1, 2, 3, the clean sweeps of the podium. That strikes me as exactly the sort of thing you'd love about cycling.
For many reasons. Rich, you said there that it was definitely the closest Paris-Roubaix ever. Was it closer than 1993 Duclos-Lassalle and Ballerini? Surely not.
Well, I mean, that's a very good point. I'm not sure I have scientific evidence to back this up, or a photo finish to hand, I'm afraid.
There was also a joint win, wasn't there, in the late 40s, early 50s, when somebody went the wrong way, and was it Serge Coppi, Fausto Coppi's brother, was one of the riders, I think. I'd have to check.
Serge Coppi won Paris-Roubaix, didn't he, in 1949? Is that correct? I'm going to look that up now.
Well, yeah. Anyway, Daniel, you must be able to tell us a bit about Mappé's fascination with Paris-Roubaix.
Because there was the very famous Paris-Roubaix in 1996, where the three of them came in together, Museu and Bortolami and Taffy, and there was a controversy rumbled on for years about who exactly had dictated the order they were going to finish in. And Patrick Lefevre, who was the manager of Mapei then and is the manager of Omega Pharma Quickstep, has always denied that it was him who chose the order. And Giorgio Squincy, the boss of the Mapei company, has always denied that it was him who chose it. And there are various stories about that. I mean, in terms of Mapei and their sort of great Paris-Roubaix riders, their great Paris-Roubaix teams, you can't obviously forget Franco Ballerini, who won in 95 and then again in 98. I think from my point of view, Ballerini was almost the sort of definitive Paris-Roubaix rider in that it was really the only thing that he was exceptional at as a professional cyclist. He just kind of happened upon this race. Had Paris-Roubaix never existed, we probably would have never paid much attention to Ballerini. He used to talk about riding on the cobbles as though imagining you were riding on velvet, and just a fantastic technician when it came to riding on the cobbles. An absolutely lovely man who, of course, died unfortunately in 2010 in a rally car crash. I don't think Ballerini was an angel by any stretch of the imagination, as far as sort of the era that he rode in, the team that he rode in Italy. And there were various investigation, or he was certainly linked with one doping investigation in Italy. But in spite of that, I think a fantastic exponent of riding on the cobbles, and like I say, a really very charming gentleman. Certainly anyone who met him would confirm that.
Yeah, I think when he retired, didn't he wear a T-shirt that said Merci Roubaix on, and he unveiled that as he crossed the line. And then, of course, in tribute, after he had died, I can't remember who it was, but I mean, somebody in the velodrome unveiled a banner that said Merci Franco, didn't they? I think so. There's a sort of a real the people of that watch Paris-Roubaix do really take the riders that win it or just survive it. They take them to their heart.
This is the Cycling Podcast with Richard Moore, Lionel Burney and Daniel Freed.
Okay, we've still got to hear from the man who is arguably Mr. Paris-Roubaix, Tom Boonen, but we're going to hear in a moment from perhaps future Mr. Paris-Roubaix, Taylor Phinney, and we're going to also hear from our very own, the podcast's very own cobbled specialist, the master of the pavé, and we're not talking about Buff, although he does like a bit of Buff as well. Lionel,
and indeed a bit of cobbler.
Lionel, you've excelled over the cobbles, haven't you?
Well, I wouldn't say excelled, but in 2008 I did ride the full 260 kilometre sportive. There's actually two sportive events. One is organised by the Vélo Club de Roubaix, and it's every other year. So I think that I'm right in saying it's still even years. So they do.
So you rode it in 2009.
No, I rode it in 2008. That's an even year. Yeah, they do the full route, although they don't start in Compiègne. They start in a place called Boonen, which is just a little bit north of there. But it's a long route. It covers all of the sort of 100 and odd kilometres of not flat roads at all. The first section is not flat. People think, it's a nice flat gentle. It's not. It's quite undulating, quite rolling, and then you get to Troisville, and from that point on, it just a war of attrition. And I remember feeling really good at the start. I was riding.
You would hope so.
Yeah, no. I mean, when I say the start, I mean the start of the cobbles. So still 130, 150 kilometres to go. There was a point though after the Arenberg, I was worried about the Arenberg because the surface is so bad. It's a real jarring, jolting experience. You feel every single hit. It's the worst section by far, and I was determined not to take the coward's line and go on the softer earth at the side. I rode over the stones, and really after that I just unravelled pavé section by pavé section, and by the
I thought you meant you unravelled. No, you did unravel.
Well, I rapidly got tired, and by the Marc Madiot section at Orchies, which is the one where the motorway bridge is often a good vantage point for the fans, and it kind of does a right-hand turn. The guy I'd been riding with, who I'd been leading over the sections up to that point, he came into his own, and by a few more sections on from that,
Well, if you will, go riding with Tom Boonen.
Yeah. A few more sections after that, he was dropping me and I was hanging on. And I remember we got to the last feed station, and he needed to visit the lavatory for a number 2, and there was a bit of a queue. So I had the opportunity to get something to eat, and after a whole day of eating very sweet stuff, energy gels and cakes and biscuits and stuff, they'd laid on some bits of cheese and ham and salami, and I ate so much of this stuff and then fell asleep in a plastic chair. And then when my riding companion came back out of the toilet after a good 15-20 minutes, he had to wake me up to ride the last 45k to the finish.
Well, he got a bit more than we bargained for there, I think. A good reception in the velodrome.
I don't remember too much other than
crackle.
It was obviously being documented for a magazine feature, and the photographer missed me as I came into the velodrome and asked me to do another lap so he could get a picture of me crossing the line, and I very nearly had a massive fit about that, because I just didn't want to get back onto my bike and ride another 200 metres. It was a real gruelling day. We were out there a long time, and that event is held in June every other year, and it has a huge field, and there's a real sense of camaraderie out there. You see clubs come over from Italy and even Spain, and loads of French clubs, lots of Brits, and you see everything. I mean, I saw somebody riding along with his saddle snapped off and he's just hovering above a seat post.
Oh my God.
Let's end this. Let's end this.
But we should say that ASO also do their own sportive, which is not quite as long, and it's on the day before the pro race in April, I think. So, but yeah, that's enough of me talking about Paris-Roubaix.
It sounds very, very tempting. I think we can hear from Taylor Phinney now.
Yeah, Taylor Phinney, the American rider, won the under-23 edition consecutive years, I think, 2 consecutive years, and since turning pro he's ridden twice, finishing I think sort of 23rd and 15th. He's getting closer to where he wants to be, but I wanted to know what the difference between the under-23 race and the pro race is, and also whether a position in the top 15, what is the gap like from there to being on the podium?
You can compare the two on just on a course basis, but when it comes to the competition level, it's obviously much higher. In the pros, it's much more nervous, much more difficult to stay in position. It's 70 kilometers longer than the under-23 race, which is a pretty big difference. However, you do most of the sectors as an under-23 that you would do as a pro, so the level is so much higher that it's.
When you won the under-23 race, how much did you know about the opposition? Because in the pro race, obviously, who the main riders are going to be, who are going to try and make the race happen. Was it different in the under-23s?
Yeah, it was a little bit different, but I knew most of the guys. All the guys that I came to the line with in both editions, I knew from just racing them in the past, kind of riders they were. But there's not so much media hype and talk as there is obviously before the under-23 edition as there is before the pro edition.
And without wanting to pile any pressure on you, what are you looking to try and achieve in the race this year?
Well, I'd like to have a good build-up. I'd like to sort of prove myself in some of the classics beforehand, and then be able to go to Paris-Roubaix with a lot of confidence and with the team's confidence, and hopefully be a protected rider and get to experience the support of the team, for me, and go for that podium. But it's definitely a hard man's race, a big man's race, and does take some experience that I am just continuing to learn. So.
Is there quite a big jump from the finishing in the groups sort of 2-3 minutes down and getting into the moves that actually go and make the race happen at the front?
Definitely a huge jump from being top 20 to being in the top 8-10 guys that make the selection. It's when you're in the top 20, you're just kind of surviving over time, whereas when you get to the front, you actually have to make that big effort to be there. That's kind of my main focus for this edition, is just to be there and experience the front of the race, and then play my cards from there. But it's easier said than done.
The Cycling Podcast, interviews and analysis. We've got the big talking points covered.
Well, Roger de Vlaeminck, the great Belgian rider, is known as Mr. Paris-Roubaix because he won the race 4 times in the 70s. The merest mention of de Vlaeminck gets Daniel very excited, as we heard a few weeks ago in the heated debate. More of that coming up shortly. But recently I caught up with Tom Boonen, who equalled de Vlaeminck's record when he won a 4th edition of Paris-Roubaix, and he's gunning for a 5th this year.
Already winning it 4 times was already more than I ever expected it from my career. Now I'm at the border of maybe a 5th victory. Of course, I will be trying to do everything in my possibilities to win it. But I think it will make a difference about being a really big rider or probably one of the legends of cycling. So, of course, it's one of my biggest objectives for this season.
Well, they call Roger de Vlaeminck Mr. Paris-Roubaix, so if you won a 5th, maybe they'd have to call you Lord Paris-Roubaix or Sir Paris-Roubaix or something.
That's up to the world to decide what my nickname will be, but of course there's only one Mr. Paris-Roubaix, and that's Roger, but I'm happy to share the title already with him, and maybe they will make up something new.
Of your 4 wins so far, which one stands out to you as the most memorable?
The last one was pretty amazing with my 55-kilometer solo. Emotionally wise, the first one, because the first one you can never repeat the feelings you have the first time.
Sean Kelly says that he would try to go out training after Paris-Roubaix, but when he won, there was too much media the following day. What's your approach? Do you have to go out and do a training effort just to loosen the legs?
It's kind of strange because after Paris-Roubaix, most of the riders, their hands are full of blisters and they really can't move for the first few days. But I'm really fine. I never had any blisters or anything after Paris-Roubaix, so I think it's all about the way you handle the bike as well, and the way you move on the bike and on the cobblestones. It's a really grueling, hard race, but most of the time I recover pretty well of it.
Can you compare the cobbles from the Tour of Flanders to Paris-Roubaix, or are they completely different?
No, they're unique. There's only one day like Paris-Roubaix in the year, and that's what makes it so special. The cobbles of the Tour of Flanders, there's a few hard sections, especially on the Quaremont, but the cobbles of Paris-Roubaix, they're like before the war, and they threw some bombs on it on the war, and that's what left of them, and then we have to ride our bikes over them.
Do you have a favourite section of pavé and a least favourite section?
Maybe my favourite section would be the forest of Valère. It's really fast in the beginning. It gets harder. The cobblestones get harder in the middle section, and then it starts going uphill a little bit in the end. It's gruelingly long, and you enter the forest, and then you get into this kind of phase like in your fighter plane, because you're vibrating so hard and the speed is so high. So you really have to focus to find the right line on the cobblestones, if there is any. But it's probably the hardest part of road in the world.
It's like almost a sprint finish just to get into the cobbles, and then now the organisers move the barrier, so you can't even go onto the softer track on the side.
Sometimes when the weather was good the few days before the race or the week before the race, you had a few nice spots where you just get off the cobblestones for like 50 meters or 20 meters even. But just to get the tension of your arms and to focus a little bit and to look for the right track again. So that's gone now completely. So you have to really, it's just about the guy that dies last. He stands up at the end of the cobblestones. But it's also a section where you really have to be in front, because if you're in the 20th position, normally you're fine. But if something's happened, the road is blocked straight away.
You can't win the race at Arenberg, but you can lose it. So where is the place where you look to win the race? Is it the Carrefour de l'Arbre, which comes quite close to the end?
It depends. If you look back at the last 10-20 years, most of the time the decisive move is made on the asphalt. So Paris-Roubaix is a race where you always have to pay attention. The cobblestones wear you down, and sometimes the right moment is just after the cobblestones. So you really have to pay attention on the wind, the competitors, the guys who you're riding with, and decide on the moment which is the moment, when the moment is right.
Is that because everyone relaxes after the pavé? There's a little lull, and so it's a perfect time to attack?
Yeah, I think it's human nature. They want to go. You arrive at the cobblestones, and everybody's like, yeah, now it's the time. So they go hard, and nobody really thinks what comes after the cobblestones. Sometimes you go right or left, and then there's a little bit of side wind, and save a little bit on the cobblestones, and then you go. And most of the time, everybody's a little bit dead at that point, and it's probably most of the time the best moment.
And very lastly then, arriving in the velodrome in Roubaix, presumably on your own, is the most beautiful moment. But what's that experience like, coming into the velodrome with the race up for grabs if you're in a group?
It's goosebumps all over your body. I did it 2 times solo and 2 times with a small group. Winning it in a sprint is of course the most hectic and the most stressful. But if you arrive solo and you have those last 2-3 kilometers to really enjoy yourself, and you arrive to the velodrome, and the sounds going up and up and up and up, it's like you're entering the arena. It's an amazing feeling.
You're listening to the Cycling Podcast. Tweet us at cycling_podcast.
So that was Tom Boonen talking about Paris-Roubaix, what makes it such a special race, the cobbles and the velodrome, and his chances of winning a 5th race this year. But now for the real contest of the spring, Daniel Friebe against Richard Moore in the heated debate.
The heated debate.
They're flexing their muscles, both of them. We are going to debate who is the true Mr. Paris-Roubaix. Obviously, Daniel is going to be stating the case for Tom Boonen. Roger de Vlaeminck, and Richard will counter with Tom Boonen. And I'm just interested to hear whether Daniel's got anything more to say about de Vlaeminck after the extraordinary heated debate several weeks ago. So, are we ready, chaps?
Yes.
Daniel, you'll be going first. You have 1 minute to state the case for Roger de Vlaeminck. Why is he Mr. Paris-Roubaix?
Well, Roger de Vlaeminck, obviously known as Mr. Paris-Roubaix because he's got an endless love, Lionel Richie, for Paris-Roubaix. He's won it 4 times. We've heard about his llamas before. We've heard about his wife carrying. Don't forget the wife carrying World Championship when he finished 2nd. We've not heard about his 400-kilometre training rides that he used to do every Wednesday. He claims to do 400 kilometres. We've not heard about the full-size football pitch in his garden. We've not heard about how, if you ask Roger de Vlaeminck which football team he supports, you'll still be there 15 minutes later because he goes through every EU country telling you which football team he supports. Have we heard about Roger de Vlaeminck, the way he abandoned the 1978 Giro d'Italia in style? He got off his bike halfway up the Passo Mangan and sprinted into the woods. His direct sportif couldn't locate him. He was AWOL for several days, perhaps not several days, but that's what he claimed. Have we also spoken before about Roger de Vlaeminck being caught in bed with a very famous judoka, Belgian judoka, vaulting out the window?
That, I'm afraid, that is a great story to end on. I want to hear more about that, certainly, but time has defeated us. So next time Roger de Vlaeminck is the subject of the heated debate, I suspect we'll hear the second half of that story. Out of interest, who is his favourite English football team?
I can't remember. I've got it on tape. I'll tell you next week. I can remember that he supported Benfica in Portugal, but literally every European country has got a different favourite team.
There's only 2 teams to choose from in Portugal, to be fair, though, isn't there? So, you know. Anyway,
on that note, what's his favourite team in Scotland? Can we hear from Roger de Vlaeminck on the podcast? Can we get him on the podcast sometime?
Yeah, why not? I
don't really feel like we need him. I'm pretty confident I can win this heated debate.
Well, that's going to be up to the listeners to decide, of course. Richard, are you ready to state the case for Tom Boonen? Why should Tom Boonen be thought of forevermore as Mr. Paris-Roubaix?
Well, I think it could be confirmed beyond any argument if he wins a 5th one. He's won 4 already. He's 33. There's every chance he'll win it again. There's every chance he'll win it again this year. There are 3 reasons that I can identify why he should have the edge over Roger de Vlaeminck. One is that he's been winning Paris-Roubaix in the era of the specialist. The guys that de Vlaeminck beat, a lot of them were kind of all-rounders. They rode in Grand Tours, they won Grand Tours as well. Whereas Boonen has been beating guys like Cancellara, Hushoff, Fletcher, George Hincapie, guys who've really based their entire seasons or put a lot of emphasis on performing well in the cobbled classics. Second, longevity. He has won his 4 Paris-Roubaix between 2005 and 2014. De Vlaeminck won over just a mere 6-year period. I think also pressure. Boonen has had to deal with a lot more pressure in the era of the sort of rock star cyclists, particularly in Belgium. And I think I should win this heat debate because Daniel was just reheating arguments they made a few weeks ago for Roger de Vlaeminck in connection to Tirreno Adriatico.
There we are.
Does have a llama, Rich? Does he have in his garden a beautiful Japanese water feature, very reminiscent of Mr. Miyagi's in the first Karate Kid?
Yes, he does.
How did Boonen get on in the wife-carrying World Championships? Do we know?
Look, he is trying to win Paris-Roubaix in the era of the specialist. I think what he's doing is more impressive than what de Vlaeminck
also,
did.
Can I just pull you up on George Hincapie being a Paris-Roubaix specialist is basing his whole season around that? Would you say that's accurate?
I said putting a lot of emphasis on performing well in the cobbled classics.
Would Lance agree with you there?
Who?
Anyway, enough. You know, you've.
What do you think, Lionel?
Well, I think the listeners will go with de Vlaeminck because I think we're establishing something of a trend here, and that Roger de Vlaeminck will win every heated debate, even when he's not the subject of the heated debate.
Can you just Hashtag heated debate to give us your verdict on who wins the heated debate.
Yeah, simple. Daniel or Richard, hashtag heated debate. And we'll tot up the votes and we'll crown Daniel the winner next week. Okay, well, that's quite enough of the heated debate and quite enough Roger de Vlaeminck for 1 week. More of the same next week. All that leaves us to do is say farewell. So thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you, Lionel.
And thank you very much, Daniel.
Thanks, Lionel.
And we'll catch you all again next week.
The Cycling Podcast. Subscribe on iTunes, listen on Audioboo, and visit us at thecyclingpodcast.com.